Poor girl hands in dirty resume after walking in the rain. Millionaire smiles when he sees her name, and when he calls the next day, the call changes everything. The paper was wet, wrinkled, the ink on her name almost running down with the rainwater. The other candidates laughed as she handed her resume to the drenched reception desk, wearing a patched coat with mud on the edges of her jeans. "Are you here to ask for a job or a handout?" one of the girls whispered, as she secretly filmed with her cell phone. Across the room, he, the company's CEO, impeccably suited with a watch worth more than many a car, watched the scene with a wry smile. But when the receptionist mockingly handed the resume to him, he froze. The name. That name. His eyes widened. It couldn't be a coincidence. He immediately jumped up from his chair while everyone was still laughing at her, unaware that, in that instant, the tables had turned. The next morning, she woke to her cell phone ringing. An unknown number. She answered with a shaky voice, expecting another rejection, but the voice on the other end was firm, almost emotional. "I need to talk to you. Today. In person." She hesitated, uncomprehending, until he added, "Your name. Do you have any idea what it means to me?" Instantly, buried memories came flooding back, of a time she pretended not to remember, and he pretended never existed. When they stood face to face, in a discreet Brooklyn cafe, he looked at her as if she were a ghost. "You saved my life and I let you disappear." The rain beat against the glass. She said nothing, but what he revealed at that table would change everything she thought about the past and about him. Before continuing, I want to invite you to subscribe to the channel and like this video so you can continue receiving our real stories. Thank you very much. The reception clock read 8:42 a.m. when the first raindrops began to drum on the tall windows of the company's imposing Manhattan headquarters. The polished and gleaming marble staircase contrasted with the dirty, soaked shoes of those who dared arrive without a car. Outside, the storm raged as if the sky were crying for someone. Inside, the atmosphere was another world. Expensive perfume, restrained laughter, voices with controlled accents. Candidates for the executive assistant position crowded onto modern benches, carrying plastic folders and resumes on fine paper. Except for her. She entered, head down, holding a manila envelope that looked like it had already been through a war. Her hair stuck to her face, the cuffs of her pants splattered with mud, and a look that mixed courage and desperation. She stopped at the counter and took a deep breath. "Good morning. I came to submit my resume for the position." The receptionist looked at her with disdain, as if her mere presence was an affront to the place's aesthetics. "Do you have an appointment?" he asked, his mockery unmistakable. She shook her head silently. Beside her, two applicants laughed. One of them discreetly filmed the scene with her cell phone, already imagining the viral video. "Wet woman asks for a job in a luxury office." From the top of the glass mezzanine, silently observing everything, stood Ethan Monroe, CEO of Monroe Group, one of the largest technology and investment holding companies in the United States. Young, ambitious, and with a reputation for ruthlessness, Ethan didn't usually waste time with interviews. But that day, something about that girl caught his attention, not charitably, but as if he sensed something off-script was about to happen. He saw her hand over the crumpled envelope, saw the laughter of the others, saw the receptionist shake the paper like a wet rag, and finally saw his eyes fall on the name written at the top of the page. What Ethan felt in that instant, no one could have guessed. But he froze. The name. It wasn't a common name, and he knew with every fiber of his being that he'd read that name before, in a place no one there would even imagine. He walked down the stairs with calm steps, but his eyes were warring. He passed the chairs with barely concealed haste, and upon reaching the reception desk, took the envelope from the attendant's hands without saying a word. She, surprised, stood still, uncomprehending. He looked her in the eye for 2 long seconds. Then he said in a neutral tone, "Can you come with me, please?" The other candidates widened their eyes. One of them asked too loudly, "Her? Is she going to be interviewed?" But he was already far away, walking down the marble corridors with her behind. Inside the glass room, where the sound of the rain was muffled, Ethan sat across from her. He didn't ask her name. He just stared at her resume as if it were a riddle. "Are you sure you want to work here?" She hesitated. "It's a position, and I need—" But he interrupted. "Do you know who I am?" She blinked, startled. "The owner, the CEO." He nodded, but his eyes were now fixed on the date of birth on her resume, and beside it her last name. Like a memory returning like a knife, he whispered, "You are the daughter of Elizabeth Wren." She paled. No one ever connected that last name to anything. It was almost erased from history. But Ethan knew. He knew because he owed her more than his life. And she knew it too. She knew it from the moment she saw the building. She knew it was him. But she pretended. Because sometimes pain demands silence. And justice, too. Ava Wren's childhood. Never had the smell of baking cake or the sound of laughter in wide hallways. She grew up among cardboard boxes and donated blankets, in temporary shelters and houses with difficult names that always changed. Her mother, Elizabeth, was a part-time nurse, always exhausted, always with dark circles under her eyes, but with a gentle smile that made Ava believe everything would be okay, even when the power went out, even when the rain poured through the tin roof. Dad. Well, he left before Ava learned. To say why. What remained of him was a name crossed off her birth certificate and a debt that Elizabeth carried in her eyes. Despite her mistakes, Ava was never bitter. She learned early on that the world didn't give gifts, but it did give choices. You either became stone or root. She chose to be root. When she was 10, Ava saw her mother come home with shaking hands. She'd lost her job for missing 3 consecutive days. She was caring for a patient who had a nervous breakdown and refused to be left alone. The hospital didn't care. But the patient was a rich boy, abandoned by his parents in an expensive nursing home. Ethan Monroe. Ava's mother cared for him as if he were her own son for 2 weeks. She read to him. She cried with him. She soothed his nightmares. She saved his life emotionally and perhaps physically, though no one acknowledged it. Then she disappeared from history, and Ava grew up with that memory as a sacred secret. When her mother died of cancer at 39, Ava found, among her papers, a letter never sent. It was addressed to an Ethan M., just 3 lines long. "You were more than a patient. You were a son for 2 weeks. I hope you've become the man you promised. Elizabeth." Ava tucked that letter away in the back of a book and never told anyone. She grew up silent, working since she was 14, cleaning diners, selling jewelry on the corner, and studying at night. Every test, every step, was a promise to her mother's memory. But the world always seemed to be working against her. When she finished business school with a scholarship she nearly lost due to overwork and little sleep, no company wanted her. Her resume was too good for basic services, too poor for the corporate world. Until, one rainy day, with no money for the subway, she walked for miles and entered a building she never imagined she would cross. She handed in her resume, unaware that on the other side of the city, someone was reading that name for the first time in over a decade. And felt the ground give way beneath her feet. The Monroe Group office was famous for its trainee program, but the selection process was also notoriously brutal behind the scenes. The initial phases were technical, but the final stage, the one Ava faced on that rainy day, was different. Candidates were taken to a large glass room where they waited for hours to be called individually. Inside, a camera transmitted in real time to the directors their behavior, body language, and even how each person interacted with others. It was called the presence test, where it wasn't enough to know. You had to stand out socially, and that's exactly where the trap began. The other 3 finalists had already blended in from the start, dressed in designer clothes, manicured nails, light makeup, and with smiles of people who knew they belonged. When Ava walked in, her shoes still wet and her hair slowly drying, the trio looked at each other with barely concealed contempt. Whispered comments began to spread like smoke. She walked here. I wonder if she knows Uber. Look at the state of her pants. It'll be nice to have someone to clean up after the meeting. Ava pretended not to hear, but her eyes registered everything. She was there on merit, but the world seemed intent on reminding her where she came from. It was then that one of the candidates, Lauren, the sharpest, stood up and looked directly at her. "You know the CEO is watching us right now, right?" she said casually. Ava nodded. "Great, because he must be loving that wet from the sewer look." They laughed, but Lauren continued. "Let's make a bet, girls. Who thinks that sweetheart over there will last more than 5 minutes in the room with the CEO? One of them replied, "I'll give her 2 minutes, she'll leave crying." Lauren crossed her arms and added, "If she lasts more than 5, I'll buy lunch at 3. Ava took a deep breath. She was shaking, but not from fear, from remembering her mother, the crumpled resume, the letter never sent. The name Ethan Monroe was like a thorn stuck in her memory, and now she was there in front of the glass door that led to his office. When her name was called, silence fell. She stood, smoothed her hair with still shaky hands, and entered. The girls glanced at their watches, and the bet began. But what they didn't know was that that door wouldn't open again anytime soon, because inside the past was about to be unearthed with a force no one expected. The Monroe Group, waiting. Room on the 28th floor wasn't just an interview anteroom, it was an undeclared psychological testing ground. Everything there was designed to observe. Discreet cameras behind mirrors, hidden microphones in coffee tables, and even the receptionist's behavior was programmed to generate tension. Final candidates were taken there and held for an indefinite period of time, awaiting the final call. While they waited, they were unaware that they were being observed in real time by directors and the CEO himself, who evaluated much more than resumes. They judged human reactions, leadership, emotional control, and mastery of the environment. For someone coming from an elite bubble, it was just another test. But for someone like Ava, it was a minefield. She entered the room with her coat still damp and her head down, aware of every glance she received. She felt the eyes of 3 applicants sweeping her body like a cruel scanner. All 3 were impeccable, tailored suits, stiletto heels, French, perfume. Lauren, Madison, and Blake, that's how they called and addressed each other, an inseparable trio since the first day of the audition. They laughed, exchanged inside jokes, showed off expensive cell phones, and spoke in code that only those who studied at the same prestigious universities would understand. Ava sat in the far corner, trying to maintain her dignity amidst her mud-stained jeans and the water-stained manila envelope. She placed her resume on her lap, as if protecting the only thing that still gave her hope. It was then that Lauren stood, strode elegantly to the center of the room, and snapped her fingers in the air as if calling attention to an announcement. "Ladies, time for the bet of the day. I'll bet you $50 that our friend over there," she pointed at Ava with the pen in her hand, "will last less than 3 minutes in the room with the CEO." Muffled laughter erupted. Blake bit her lip, trying to hold back a laugh. 3? I say 2. The second she opens. Her mouth and that coffee shop accent kicks in, he'll end the interview. "A bold bet," Madison added. Lauren approached the center table, rested her hands on the glass surface, and continued, "And if she lasts 5 minutes, I'll buy you weekend brunch." Ava listened to everything. With every word, the invisible scars of her past throbbed inside her. It wasn't just about her job, it was about being worthy, about proving she could exist in a world that did everything to erase her. Silently, she pressed her fingers against the envelope, feeling the anger and pain mix with something deeper, the desire to stay, to resist. Even if her clothes didn't say so, even if her appearance was judged as a failure, she knew she couldn't afford to explode. She'd seen doors slam shut before because of misinterpreted reactions. There, in that environment varnished with arrogance, emotional control was her only weapon. Suddenly, the receptionist entered the room and announced in a neutral voice, "Ava." "Ren, Mr. Monroe will see you now." An awkward silence fell. Even the laughter stopped. Lauren raised her eyebrows as if expecting a show. Ava stood slowly, smoothed her wet hair with the palm of her hand, picked up the envelope, and walked toward the door. Behind her he heard whispers. 5 minutes. That's going to be too much. The glass door closed. On the other side, Ethan Monroe was waiting for her. Alone, standing, facing the window that overlooked New York in the rain. Without turning around, he simply said, "You haven't changed at all." And Ava froze. Time, space, memory, everything stopped. Because that sentence wasn't from a CEO to a candidate. It was about a past she'd tried to hide, and which was now coming to light, in front of everyone, without anyone outside understanding what was really happening. But the bet, she was already lost, to them, and about to be won, by her. The door closed behind her with a soft click, muffling the sounds of the reception, the laughter, the betting, all the judgment that had lingered outside. The room was large, cool and silent, with windows that looked out over the Manhattan skyline. Ava stopped a step from the entrance, her shoulders tense, the envelope still in her hand. In the center of the room, with his back to her, Ethan Monroe watched the rain running down the buildings as if the past were being projected onto the glass. For a moment he seemed unsure of what to say, or maybe he did, and just didn't know how to begin. Until, without turning around, he said, "You haven't changed at all." Ava's heart lurched. The sentence pierced her defenses like a blade. He hadn't asked her name, nor the reason for her visit. He'd recognized her, not her face, but something else. She remained still, waiting for him to say more, perhaps deny the statement, but he merely turned slowly, his eyes fixed on hers with something between disbelief and guilt. He was different from the boy from years ago. Now he was a man on top of the world, tailored suit, erect posture, trained gaze. But in his eyes, there was a crack. She swallowed. "You know me?" she asked, her voice low, almost hoarse. He nodded slowly. "Your name?" "Ava Wren. It's impossible to forget. Elizabeth Wren saved me, and you were there." Ava narrowed her eyes in confusion. "I was just a child." He walked to the table, pulled out a chair, and pointed to one opposite. "But you had the same eyes. And I promised her I'd never forget." She hesitated, before sitting down. The air felt thick, as if each word stirred dust from a past no one there had properly swept away. Ethan picked up the wet, still slightly wrinkled resume and placed it on the glass table. When I saw this in the receptionist's hands, I froze. I didn't know if I was hallucinating. He slid the paper aside and looked at her. "Did you know who I was when you came here?" Ava was slow to answer. "I did, but I didn't come for that. I came because I need a job." The sincerity in her voice was a slap in the face. He leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. "You could have used this, contacted me sooner. Tell me who you were." "And why," she countered, "to get something I don't deserve, that would be betraying everything my mother taught me." The answer silenced him. The silence between them was so thick he could hear the raindrops hitting the glass. Ethan sighed, then said something that shattered the air between them. "When she died, I only found out months later. No one told me. I should have looked. I should have done more." Ava lowered her eyes. "She didn't expect anything from you. Just that you be decent." Ethan nodded slowly. "And I did." She looked at him. Really? As if searching for the lonely boy her mother had cared for. "I still don't know." He stood up and began pacing in circles as if debating his own conscience. "You know what's weird? I dreamed about her this week, for the first time in years. And in the dream, she said you would show up." Ava kept her face impassive. "She believed in signs, I don't." Ethan stopped in front of her. "Maybe I don't either. But you being here now makes me question everything." His phone vibrated on the table. A notification. "Lauren says the wet candidate is still in the room. They bet on 3 minutes. It's been 12. Ethan looked at the message, then at Ava, and for the first time in years, he smiled with something bordering on admiration. "Looks like you've already won the first round." She didn't smile. But she didn't look down either. And in that instant, something invisible shifted in the room. The past was there. The present, too. and the future had just been shaken by a simple interview, which was never just an interview. The conference room door opened again after nearly 20 minutes. When Ava walked out, everyone's eyes in the lobby widened as if witnessing the impossible. Lauren lifted her chin with a forced expression of surprise. "Wow, survived the storm?" she said theatrically, typing on her phone and whispering to the other two. Blake pretended to be engrossed in an email, but the screen displayed the hidden camera video recorded moments earlier. The title, "The Soaked Candidate Who Thought She Could Be CEO." Ava didn't answer. She simply walked toward the elevator with a firm gaze, clutching the wet envelope as if she were holding on to her last shred of dignity. She was used to looks like that, looks that judged before listening. But there, in that environment, every second seemed programmed to crush her, and it wasn't the end yet. As she reached the ground floor, her phone vibrated. A generic message from HR. "Thank you for your presence. We will inform you of the next steps." The famous "we told you so," polite version of discard. That afternoon, as Ava walked home in the same light rain, her name was the subject of jokes in the hallways. Lauren had shared the video in the team's internal groups, and within hours it was circulating among employees on the executive floor. "The beggar with the wet resume," some said. "The CEO must be investing in charity now." No one imagined the connection between Ava and Ethan's buried past. To them, she was just another failed attempt, a wet mistake that dared to walk through the wrong door. But what came next was even worse. The next day, Ava returned to the building, not by invitation, but by insistence. She simply wanted to leave a personal letter, a response she'd written during the early hours of the tea morning, trying to organize the turmoil Ethan had reignited within her. When she entered the lobby and asked to deliver the letter on his behalf, she was denied. "You don't have access to Mr. Monroe, and frankly, he already has too many resumes," the receptionist said sarcastically. Behind her, someone was recording. Again. This time, Lauren was in the cafe downstairs, and upon seeing her, she approached with a cup of coffee in hand. "Did you come back to clean the windows?" she said, laughing. Ava didn't answer. She simply handed the letter to the receptionist, who placed it dismissively on the counter. "Maybe he'll read it, when he has time for social causes." Ava took a deep breath, trying not to let her anger explode, but the public humiliation was complete. The entire lobby watched like an audience at a cruel spectacle, and even amidst the laughter, one sentence echoed silently within her. "My mother didn't die for this." That night, in the suburbs where she lived, Ava tore up all her remaining resumes. He decided he wouldn't knock on that door anymore, not because he'd lost, but because he refused to beg where there was contempt. He just didn't know that simple letter, left with trembling hands and spent hope, would cause an earthquake in the hearts of those who least expected it, and that the public humiliation was only turning the mirror of the true shame to come, not hers, but of those who laughed, of those who recorded it, of those who mocked something they didn't even understand. 3 days had passed since the interview. 3 days of silence, no response, no call. But what Ava didn't know was that on the top floor of the Monroe Group, her name was already on Ethan's mind. The letter, previously ignored on the counter, had been retrieved by his secretary and discreetly left on his desk. He read it silently that same night, the city lights reflecting in his eyes. The words weren't a job application. They were something deeper, almost like an unspoken lament. "Have you become the man you promised my mother? Because so far all I've seen is noise." On the morning of the 4th day, Ethan decided to act. He sent a direct personal message, no intermediary. Ava was at home, sorting through old receipts for overdue bills when her phone vibrated. "Can we talk? Just you and me. No company, no titles, just two people with an intertwined past." She stared at the screen for long minutes. After everything that had happened, part of her wanted to delete that number. But another part, the part she had inherited from her mother, said that some truths only heal if they are spoken. She accepted. The meeting took place in a park in downtown New York, late in the afternoon, when the sun was hiding between the buildings and the wind seemed to sweep away memories. Ethan was waiting for her, sitting on a bench, without security, without a suit, just him, in a dark sweatshirt, looking years younger. When she arrived, he stood. He didn't try to touch her. He simply said, "Thank you for coming." Ava sat down slowly. They sat in silence for a few moments, listening to the distant sound of horns, birds, and hurried footsteps. Until she spoke, her voice firm. "I knew who you were from the start." Ethan's eyes widened slightly. "Since when?" "Since the day I decided to send in my resume. I saw your name at the top of the company. I saw your picture in an article, and I knew it was you. The boy my mother raised as if he were her own. The same one who promised he'd never forget her." Ethan lowered his head. "I haven't forgotten," Ava continued, tears welling in her eyes, but her voice never wavering. "You may not remember me, but I remember you, crying, holding her, telling me no one ever listened to you before, that the whole world wanted to mold you except her, that she was the only safe place, and after it all happened, you left, never called, never wrote, never asked." Ethan's breath began to hitch. "I was a boy. I was scared. My parents forbade me from contact. They told me that phase should be forgotten." "And you obeyed," Ava said with suppressed bitterness. "While my mother, she kept your letters, the letters you never answered, and she died believing you had become worthy." Ethan discreetly wiped his eyes. "Ava, I tried to bury you, because you reminded me of a part of me I wanted to erase. But when you walked into that room, it was as if time called me to reckon with who I was." She looked at him, and this time there was no explicit hurt. There was an ancient silence of someone who has suffered so much that they have learned to bleed inside. "I came here not for a job, but because I wanted to look into your eyes and ask, was it worth forgetting who taught you how to feel?" Ethan didn't answer right away. The wind blew hard, blowing dry leaves across the ground. Ava stood. "I knew everything, and yet I entered that company with hope. Not because I trust you, but because I still believe that the good my mother planted can still flourish, even if it's too late." She turned and walked away. Ethan stood silently, watching her silhouette disappear into the trees. For the first time in a long time, he felt ashamed. Not for Ava, but for himself. That night, Ethan didn't return home. He drove aimlessly through the streets of New York, passing through neighborhoods he hadn't been in years, stopping at traffic lights without noticing the change in light. Ava's revelation reverberated like thunder in her chest. She'd known it all along, and yet she remained silent. She didn't demand anything. She didn't ask. She just watched, as if giving time a chance to decide if he deserved to be remembered. But now the veil was gone. And in the silence of the car parked outside the former St. Wilfrid Psychiatric Hospital, everything came flooding back. It was there that he had met Elizabeth. At 16, after a nervous breakdown caused by his obsessive parents and the weight of family expectations, Ethan was quietly admitted, away from the media and public shame. He was a broken boy, hidden like a dirty secret from high society. Elizabeth, a young nurse at the time, was the only one who treated him humanely. While others avoided contact, she sat beside him at night, sang softly when he had fits, and called him "my strong boy." It lasted 2 weeks, but he clung to her with a strength that frightened him. And when he was discharged, he promised he would return, that he wouldn't be another one who disappeared. But the promise dissolved into thin air like so many others. His parents took him straight from there to Europe. Her name was wiped from his address book, and when he returned months later, he discovered she had been fired for too much emotional involvement with a patient. He never knew where she went. He never had the courage to look for her. He buried everything. Until now. Driven by an uncontrollable unease, Ethan typed Ava's full name into his internal system, accessing information that not even HR had filtered. And there it was. Ava Elizabeth Wren. Mother, deceased. Father, unknown. Previous address, a simple apartment in Queens. Ethan spent the entire night sifting through old files, hospital reports, nursing records. He found an old photo, Elizabeth with her name tag on her white coat, smiling alongside patients. And in the background, a pale boy with lost eyes. Him, Ethan. But that wasn't what shattered the ground beneath his feet. It was what he found next, a never-delivered letter scanned from the former nurse's medical record. It was the same letter Ava had mentioned, but here, kept as part of an internal report. He read it slowly. "You were more than a patient. You were a son for 2 weeks. I hope you've become the man you promised." He closed his eyes. Her voice seemed to echo among the documents. He felt small, cowardly. The woman who had saved him from the abyss, sent away for caring too much. Her daughter now had walked through the same door as him, scorned by everyone, just as her mother had been ignored by her superiors in the past. History was repeating itself, but this time, he could still choose the outcome. Ava wasn't just a candidate. She was a mirror, a reminder, and above all, a rescue. The next morning, Ethan walked into the boardroom without a suit, with messy hair and red eyes. He threw his cell phone on the executive committee table. On the screen was the video of Ava's humiliation. The recording Lauren had made, now spread throughout the company. Everyone fell silent. And then he said, "This woman is the daughter of the only person who made me want to live, and you laughed at her." The silence was so heavy, no one dared breathe. For the first time, Ethan wasn't the CEO. He was the lost boy trying to make up for lost time. And that was just the beginning. The morning after their encounter in the park, Ethan woke up earlier than usual. For the first time in years, he refused the driver's ride, turned off his work cell phone, and walked through the still empty streets, his bones chilled, his mind drowning in silence. He thought about her. Not her resume, not the candidate, but her presence. Ava had left something in him, an echo, an absence in the form of truth. For years, Ethan had collected achievements, awards, headlines, and enemies, but he had never collected someone who demanded nothing in return. Ava appeared, looked him in the eye, slashed truths like razors, and left without asking for forgiveness, without seeking pity. She simply left, and now her silence screamed. He spent the day distracted in meetings, making calculations, ignoring the charts. Every time her name appeared in the records, and it did because he was now searching for any information in the system, it was like a thread being pulled, but all paths led nowhere, no social media, no address updates. Ava had vanished from the map, as if she'd dissolved into the wind. He sent a personal email, trying not to sound desperate. "I'd like to talk more, just listen if you'll allow me." No answer. 2 days later, he tried calling. Number out of service. On the 5th day, Ethan sent flowers to the address listed in the HR department, but he was surprised by a call from the doorman. "Miss Ava Wren? She moved 3 days ago, didn't leave any contact information, didn't even say where she was going." It was then that he understood. She wasn't just leaving the company. She was getting out of his reach. And it wasn't escape, it was protection, self-preservation. Ava knew that if she stayed, Ethan would try to fix her, and she didn't want to be fixed. Not by him, not by anyone. Filled with a restlessness that bordered on anguish, Ethan returned to the hospital where it all began. St. Wilfrid's was now just an abandoned building, with boarded-up windows and graffiti on the walls. He walked through the rusty gate, walked to the room where he used to hide as a teenager, and sat on the cold floor. There, with his eyes closed, he remembered Elizabeth's soft singing, the smell of the coffee she'd sneaked into his possession, the way she'd smooth his hair when he'd wake in a panic. And he understood. Ava was the same quiet firmness, the same unassuming compassion. At that moment, he stopped thinking of her as someone who had disappeared. He began to see her as someone he himself had driven out with his absence from the past. She wasn't missing. He had just taken too long, and time, that judge who doesn't accept bribes, now forced him to feel the emptiness left by someone who had arrived offering everything and left without taking anything. The next morning, Ethan asked his team to suspend the hiring process. He cancelled meetings, traveled to Queens, and visited places mentioned in the old records. The diner where she'd worked as a teenager, the public library where she'd studied late, the donation store where she'd picked up used books. In each place he found only traces, scattered stories, discreet smiles from those who remembered her as the girl who never complained about anything. But no one knew where she was. Ava had left New York as if she'd never been there. And for the first time, Ethan experienced firsthand what it means to search for someone and not be found. On the 8th day since Ava's disappearance, the tide turned, and it wasn't silent. It started with a leak. A video recorded by Lauren and shared in Monroe Group's internal groups, escaped the company's walls and leaked onto social media. In the video, a soaking wet Ava hands out her resume to muffled laughter. The unofficial narration of the recording, clueless candidate tries for executive position in flip-flops. The video exploded on HR forums, feminist websites, corporate reporting channels, and groups discussing institutional harassment. What was supposed to be a joke turned into outrage. Comments poured in. And this is the culture of the corporate elite. Her wet resume is worth more than this entire office. Monroe Group needs to review what it calls its selection process. Those who laugh at poverty will never know the price of dignity. In less than 48 hours, Ethan Monroe became a trending topic. Not because of a billion-dollar merger, but as a symbol of a system that fostered inequality within its own ranks. The company's shares began to fluctuate. Sponsors demanded clarification. Journalists pressed for interviews. Marketing employees ran as if the building were on fire. Ethan was called into emergency meetings, but he didn't say a word. He sat in the black leather chairs of the crisis rooms with a blank stare, listening to voices that seemed like echoes of everything he himself had built, crumbling. The final straw was an open letter published on the website of one of the country's most widely read newspapers, signed anonymously, but with details that only someone very close to the story would know. The title, The Daughter of the Woman Who Saved the CEO. The text told firmly and without melodrama the story of Elizabeth Wren, the nurse fired for caring too much. The letter didn't ask for dismissal nor revenge, but it did ask for memory. It asked that the truth not be forgotten. And most strikingly, it ended with a transcription of the last sentence of Elizabeth's letter. I hope you have become the man you promised. The text went viral. Thousands of people began investigating. On their own. They found old records, hospital photos, archived statements. The story Ethan had fought so hard to bury emerged as a collective cry. The once sycophantic press elite now demanded explanations. How could such a respected CEO allow the daughter of the woman who saved him to be humiliated within the company itself? The board called a closed meeting to discuss damage control. You need to give an interview, show remorse, deny you knew. Ethan remained silent. When everyone finished speaking, he simply replied, I won't lie or hide. It's my fault. And he stormed out of the room, leaving behind stunned executives and panicked PR people. The next morning, he entered the main building unescorted, walked past reception without looking away, and when he saw Lauren approaching him with a clipboard and a tight smile, he simply said, You're fired. Today. Now. No explanation. No meeting. Her video sparked his public downfall, and she herself opened her own abyss. But Ethan knew. That wasn't enough. Sending someone away didn't undo what had been done. The world's judgment had begun, but the judgment that mattered most was still hers. Ava. The one person who, with a wet envelope, made him see that no empire can stand when built on oblivion. The Monroe Group building looked the same from the outside. Gleaming glass, spotless automatic doors, smiling receptionists. But inside, there was a change no report could measure. Ethan Monroe's heart was finally beginning to give, not to public opinion, not to investor pressure, but to the very time he had denied for so many years. For the first time, the CEO wasn't waking up to win. He was waking up to understand. Ava's silence, her sudden disappearance, her past with Elizabeth, all intertwined into a single question. What would be left of you if all the titles, figures, and recognitions were taken away? In the week following the scandal, Ethan stepped away from the company's public functions. He cancelled his participation in international conferences, suspended the filming of a campaign that would use his face as a symbol of visionary leadership, and ordered the evacuation of his own floor. He left the glass-enclosed office at the top of the building and descended, literally, to one of the smaller rooms on the second floor, where years ago interns were still interviewed. There he sat before a blank sheet of paper. No assistants, no schedule, just himself and an invisible mirror. He began by reviewing the company's entire recruitment process. He ordered a history of every silent dismissal, every resume rejected without justification. He assembled a committee of low-level employees, people who had never been asked to give their opinion on anything. He listened. He asked questions. He took notes. He began to see that it wasn't just Ava. She was a symbol. But there were dozens, perhaps hundreds of Avas who passed through the company's cold hands and were discarded before they were even seen. He visited the house where Elizabeth had lived with Ava. The new resident, a retired gentleman, recognized him immediately but didn't treat him like a celebrity. Mrs. Wren? A saint? She looked after the whole neighborhood. The girl, Ava, she would sit there on that staircase reading books she found in the trash. Ethan listened quietly, his eyes welling up. He asked if the man knew where Ava had gone. He just shrugged. She disappeared overnight, said she was going to try to live somewhere where she didn't have to ask permission to exist. It was these words that pushed him to do something unthinkable until recently. Ethan created an internal program, without fanfare, named with a name few would understand, Elizabeth Project. In it, the company would fund scholarships, corporate access programs for young people from underserved communities, and create a new admissions policy, one where character, persistence, and life story would carry as much weight as a diploma from an elite university. The press, upon finding out, tried to turn it all into an image campaign, but Ethan declined interviews. If she sees this, she'll know it's not makeup, it's a fix. One Sunday, he returned to the abandoned hospital, now surrounded by hoardings. He entered through the open side and walked to the old room where he had spent the darkest days of his youth. He carried a simple wooden frame. Inside, a copy of Elizabeth's letter. He nailed the frame to what remained of the wall and sat there on the floor for hours, alone, weeping and healing. Ethan's transformation didn't come in speech. It came in silence. It came in withholding praise. It came in actions no one asked for, because he knew nothing he did would bring Ava back. But if just one name couldn't be forgotten, then perhaps there was still hope of honoring all that she and the woman who raised her represented. And maybe, just maybe, she would hear and know that he had finally begun to become the man he promised to be. Spring arrived quietly. Flowers bloomed in the central parks, and sidewalk cafes once again filled their tables, as if the entire city were trying to forget that, weeks before, the name Ethan Monroe had been synonymous with corporate scandal. But for him, the world no longer held the same luster. Every detail now carried symbolic weight. He no longer saw the skyline as an achievement, but as a responsibility. And amidst the new rhythm of life, quiet, almost monastic, Ethan began to gradually visit the places Ava had visited. He had already searched archives, spoken to acquaintances, and listened to neighbors. But he had never run into her again, until that late afternoon. He was in Brooklyn, at a small community center, where his team had quietly begun investing as part of Elizabeth Project. He went to observe one of the professional training workshops closely, and there, among young people learning to write resumes and women who had left the market for years, he saw her. From the back, hair tied back, posture erect, calmly explaining the importance of telling an authentic story in an interview. You don't have to hide who you are to fit in with what's expected of you. What's most frightening about these glass rooms is when we walk in completely without apologizing. Ethan felt the floor give way. For a moment he hesitated to interrupt. He didn't want to barge in. He didn't want to turn this reunion into a theatrical scene, but something inside him, older, more honest, knew it had to happen. He waited until the end of the lecture. He stood at the back of the room, leaning against the wall, his heart pounding, as if he'd returned to his 16th year and was about to apologize to the one person he hadn't had the courage to reach out to. As the attendees began to leave, she turned and saw him. Time froze. Ava stood still, her eyes fixed on his, as if trying to figure out if this was real or just another memory testing her faith. He didn't smile. He didn't move forward either. He simply pulled a small, crumpled envelope from his pocket and held it out to her. She didn't move. It's not an apology letter, not a promise. It's just a request to listen. Just once. Ava approached slowly, took the envelope but didn't open it. Why did you come here? For the project? For the guilt? Ethan shook his head. For the silence. Because he screams. And I can't stand pretending I've learned anymore, without telling you. She took a deep breath. I didn't run away. I just didn't want to be defined by a mistake I didn't make, or by the eyes of someone who didn't know how to look. Ethan lowered his eyes. And now? He asked, almost in a whisper. Now, I move on. Her answer was simple, but inside him it felt like a partial absolution, not through words but through the steadfastness with which she looked at him. Ava was no longer a shadow of the past. She was the light of a new time, a woman who had learned to grow without being noticed, and who now, even when seen, no longer needed approval. He watched her walk away again, but this time without pain, because the reunion wasn't a romantic reconciliation, nor a definitive closure. It was a bridge, a sign from fate that time doesn't erase everything, but teaches, and that sometimes meeting someone again doesn't mean getting them back, but recognizing how much you've changed just by having crossed paths with them, even if it was in silence, even if it was just once. The days that followed their reunion seemed suspended in time. Ava returned to the community center as she always did, punctual, discreet, dedicated. But something had changed. A part of her, which had learned to move forward without expecting anything from anyone, now trembled at the very real possibility of being heard, of seeing in the eyes of the one who hurt her a man who might be willing to shed his pride. Still, she knew that not all healing ends with a hug. Some end with a firm step in the opposite direction. The envelope Ethan had given her remained unopened on the desk in the small studio apartment where she now lived. At night, Ava would stare at it in silence, as if conversing with a ghost. He wondered if he should open it, if reading those words would make her return to the girl who waited for answers, or if remaining silent was the only power she had left. But something inside her, perhaps an echo of her mother, perhaps weariness, told her she no longer needed to run from anything. So, one morning she opened it. Inside was a single handwritten sheet. No stamp, no letterhead, no logo. A simple letter. Ethan didn't apologize. He just told the story. He told the story of reliving the hospital. He told the story of sitting on the floor of the room where Elizabeth sang. He told the story of reading and rereading her last letter. He told the story of Elizabeth's project and how Ava had given name, purpose, and memory to a company that had forgotten all that was human. The last sentence was a silent punch. You don't have to forgive me, but I needed you to know, Marcia, that for the first time I'm becoming the man I promised, and it's because you showed me who I've always been. Ava closed her eyes. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just stood there listening to the sounds of the city in the distance, the trains passing by, the echoes of the past being carried away by time. The next morning, she took a new envelope. She wrote just one line and handed it to the Monroe. Group receptionist, unmarked. The receptionist recognized the name and called the executive floor, stammering, "There's a letter. From Miss Wren." When Ethan opened the note later, he found only one sentence, written firmly, almost like a sentence. Forgiving is not forgetting. It is choosing to no longer carry what is not mine. And that's how she decided. Ava didn't take a job. She didn't accept an invitation. She didn't reach out to bond. But she didn't close herself off either. She gave Ethan exactly what he didn't know he needed, the freedom to change without the obligation to be loved for it. Her forgiveness wasn't romantic, nor symbolic. It was real, practical, and like everything else in her life, it came without spectacle, but with a weight that reshaped the world. That afternoon, Ava returned to the community center and ended her talk with a phrase that carried more than anyone there could have imagined. Some pain doesn't need to be avenged. It needs to be understood. And some people, even if they regret it, don't return to our path, but they can still make the path less dark. When she left, the wind carried leaves across the ground, and the clear sky announced that the season had changed. It was changing inside her too, because deep down she knew sometimes moving on is the highest act of mercy, and the most just goodbye anyone can give. The old St. Wilfrid Hospital, now preserved in ruins, had been anonymously purchased by a foundation. The windows were restored, the garden replanted. It never became a hospital again, nor a museum. But there, amidst quiet corridors and clean brick walls, something new was born. Discreet, without advertising, a listening space, no name on the facade, no protocols. Just a simple wooden sign at the entrance with 2 words, Elizabeth Room. On that grey Saturday morning, a young woman entered alone. She wore a light coat, her hair tied back, and held a notebook. She walked down the main hallway in silence, as if recognizing each wall, each step. When she reached the back room, she found a wooden bench under the window. She sat down slowly. She took a deep breath. In the corner of the wall, an old frame held a copy of a letter with a faded signature. Elizabeth Reneva ran her fingers over the glass as if greeting without touching. Outside, unseen, a man stood watching from afar. He didn't come in. He just waited. When she came out, hours later, their eyes met. No smile, no word, just a slight nod. He remained there. She moved on, and for a moment, the whole world seemed at peace. A bird landed on the living room's open window, and in the light breeze that blew through the hallway, a page from Ava's notebook was left behind, forgotten on the bench. On it was a sentence scrawled in pencil. Silence is also a legacy, and sometimes it is in it that justice flourishes. The leaf fluttered in the air, then rested on the ground. And then, nothing more. If you've made it this far, it's because this story spoke to you in some way. So tell me in the comments, would you have forgiven or turned your back? Your opinion is worth a lot here. Enjoy and leave a like. It helps us continue bringing you stories that truly touch you. And if you're not subscribed yet, click the red button now because there's a lot of powerful stuff coming. By the way, the next video is already appearing on the screen. Click on it now and get ready. It's another story that will touch your heart. I'll see you there.